Good afternoon. Welcome back. I'm Jeremy Mark. I'm a senior fellow with the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm here to host a conversation about low-income country debt, one of the key issues before this forum and the IMF World Bank meetings. It is an issue that has been given tremendous attention in recent years, particularly since the onset of the COVID pandemic in 2020. It was a landscape-changing event that happened that in the sense that low-income countries, both the poorest countries and emerging market countries, suddenly faced an unprecedented economic crisis because of the COVID pandemic. The end result being that debt built up rapidly, and many countries were simply unable to pay their debts. This became an issue that was a central focus of meetings of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Group of 20 emerging market and advanced economies who often meet during these meetings. Literally from the moment that the crisis hit. Throughout this period, my guest and I wrote a great deal about this issue. We've been following the various developments over the past 4 years. The most important was probably an effort by the G20 under the auspices of the IMF and World Bank to design a new approach to debt restructuring affecting sovereign debt. That's to say, loans that countries took out from other governments. This became a crucial issue in 2021, 2022, and the G20 devised a system called the Common Framework that it hoped would be able to lead many countries into debt restructuring that would enable them to return to growth and deal with some of the very serious issues that affected their populations during the pandemic. My guest today to talk about this is a long-time IMF official, a long-time government official, and a banker as well, Vasuki Shastry, who was a colleague of mine for many years at the IMF, also worked for the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and then went on to a career at Standard Chartered Bank in London. He's now an author of several books on international economic issues, and someone I've worked quite closely with on this issue in recent years. Vasuki, welcome.
Delighted to be here, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, let's dive right into this and sort of start with a sense of perspective. I quickly described how the international community responded to this rapidly growing debt problem earlier in this decade. At one point, it was estimated that 60 countries were in debt distress, and nearly 20 in one way or another have defaulted on debt. So tell me, how do you assess the progress or lack of progress on debt restructuring that we've seen over the past 4 years since COVID hit?
Yes, I think you laid out the framework very well on where we are. But if I may, I'd like to add a little bit of an emotional pitch to this conversation, because I think any conversation on debt restructuring tends to be all about the numbers. So for the low-income countries which have suffered a lot in the pandemic era and are still attempting to restore economic growth, this has really been a tragedy. It's been a tragedy because despite considerable international attention at the outset of the pandemic, you're still seeing many countries struggling to achieve the end point in debt restructuring, and I'm sure we're going to go through country cases in the next half hour or so. And at the same time, what the World Bank said yesterday in their report titled The Great Reversal, many of these low-income countries are just not seeing economic growth. So while the rest of the global economy appears to be recovering quite smartly, we may well be faced with a situation where for the next decade or so, many of these LICs are going to struggle. The other T in this conversation, from my perspective, I think it's a travesty that the international community, despite good intentions, despite the attention it has paid on getting the right platform, getting the right process, and getting the right instruments, and again, we should talk about this in detail. There's still some holdouts in the international community, no names at this stage.
We'll get there.
We will get there, no doubt. So you have this incredibly complicated debt restructuring process. Many of us would have thought that it would have reached a logical endpoint perhaps in Marrakesh last year at the IMF World Bank annual meeting. So here we are in the spring in Washington, D.C., and it still seems to be a huge hurdle.
You're suggesting there's been very little progress.
I'm suggesting there has been progress. I mean, I don't think we can say there's been no progress at all. But the ultimate objective of any debt restructuring exercise is really restoration of economic growth, is really being able to tell a Ghana or a Zambia or even a Sri Lanka that you've put your debt problems firmly behind you, and now you can focus on creating the right conditions for economic opportunity and growth. And we're somewhere in this twilight zone at the moment.
Let's delve a little bit into the indebtedness situation itself. It's, as you said, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers. Is there a human impact of this sort of situation where countries are on the brink of debt default, trying to repay their debts? Is there a cost?
There's a huge human cost because ultimately, at the end of the day, finance ministers want to balance their books. In exchange for international attention, international aid, and debt forbearance, you've got to kind of fix your budget. And this happens oftentimes on the back of social spending, and oftentimes on the back of small businesses not being able to access credit in their countries. So there is a human cost. And one manifestation of that human cost is seeing the flow of refugees from many parts of sub-Saharan Africa into Europe and other parts of the world. And if the international community truly believes that it wants to put this refugee problem behind it, one way of addressing it is to trying to fix the debt restructuring as soon as it can.
You talked about how this can really weigh upon a population. You mentioned the Great Reversal report from the World Bank. They had two numbers that really jumped out to me that basically were something like 92% of the people in the world who are in extreme poverty are in countries that are facing heavy debt and lack of growth, and something like 70% of people who do not have access to affordable, nutritious food are also living in these countries. So it really, the difference in where the money goes, whether the money flows to social services or the money flows to creditors, can make a big difference.
Huge difference, and I think it's important to look at the geopolitical context. I mean, you mentioned nutrition, so food prices have been under stress, mainly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You've had supply chain dislocations, you've had drought in many corners of the world, which has made food availability much more acute and much more difficult. So all of this comes on top of a debt restructuring crisis, where you've got many more new players in this area. It's not like the good old days 2 decades ago when you had a small club of creditors who were able to resolve all of these issues pretty expeditiously. Yeah. So the complexity in the global landscape is, I think, a new variable.
And then how is this played out in the so-called common framework, the G20 approach to debt restructuring?
I mean, many people think that the common framework is pretty uncommon because very good intentions, as I noted earlier. I think it's important to get all the parties under one framework, under one template, so that everyone is, the objective is everyone sings from the same hymn sheet. But what we are seeing both on the private sector side and probably the panda in the room here, which is China, is there are differentiated approaches being taken in the way the issue, in the way debt is labeled, right? Much of China's debt exposure, some of it is labeled private sector, and we can argue on whether that description is appropriate or not. But what happens as a result of this mislabeling is it makes it all the more difficult to get these creditors and debtors to agree on what is a very, very noble initiative, is the common framework.
You talked about the club that used to exist. In fact, there is something called the Paris Club, which is the grouping essentially of G7 creditor countries who've worked informally over the years to restructure loans. In a sense, that was a club that was led by the United States and for many years, in part because, if not itself, the United States government had sway over the money center banks based in the U.S. and Europe that were the primary lenders. This has changed now, hasn't it? With China being the primary source of credit during the period of sort of 2012 to 2020. And do you think that has shifted, should we say, the locus of decision making or influence on the issue?
Absolutely, it has, and I'd like to hear your perspective on China because you're much more closer to the issue than I am. But the construct that the Paris Club only belongs to Europe and the US, I think is somewhat has been challenged. The fact that you have India, which is a major creditor to Sri Lanka, and India very early on not only provided considerable financial assistance to Sri Lanka to tide over the political crisis that they had 2 years ago. But India has aligned its approach with the IMF and the World Bank and the Paris Club, right? So I think there's a problem here in this messy geopolitical world that we are living in, that certain countries have taken the conscious choice that even though the recipe and the prescription of having all the creditors under one roof to negotiate with countries in debt distress. I think that principle is a very important one, and that's what the common framework is attempting to achieve. But China, for very, very complicated reasons, appears to have peeled away from that process.
And it's interesting because about 10 years ago, and I knew this from my time here at the IMF, about 10 years ago, there were parties within the Chinese government, most likely led by the People's Bank of China, the central bank, who lobbied very hard internally for China to join the G20. And I'm sorry, not the Paris Club. And that decision went up to very highest levels of the Chinese government, where it was finally decided that no, China would not be part of the Paris Club. If it had joined, it might have been a somewhat different process that unfolded after COVID hit. But I think instead what has happened is China has insisted on maintaining freedom of maneuver. It has insisted on protecting its interests, and these interests are not insignificant. Many of the viewers will be familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, China's effort to develop infrastructure throughout emerging and developing countries with an eye to strengthening their economies as well as of giving contracts to Chinese companies and new sources of markets, et cetera. Railroads, ports, roadways, telecommunications, you name it. China's lending through the Belt and Road and other similar initiatives exceeded $2 trillion, which is just a vast amount of money. And that has given China unprecedented weight in this process of determining debt because its exposure is the highest. And I think this is very much a case of the person who has owed the most ultimately has the biggest vote in these situations.
Yeah, I think you described it well. And if you look at this from the perspective of, and I think the comparison with what happened over a decade ago and today is an important one from a recipient country point of view. And I think, Jeremy, you're familiar. 10, 15 years ago in these meetings, you had finance ministers from many of the low-income countries which are in debt distress today, who were very openly and positively noting that they were not getting that much attention and aid from more traditional donors, that China was basically the only game in town. And there was a sense that the Chinese, there was a certain benevolent underlying objective in the way China dispensed money, and not many people thought about the consequences. So here we are, 10, 15 years down the line, with countries like Sri Lanka, like Zambia, to a more limited extent, Ghana, all facing pressure, mainly because of the dominant role of China in these debt negotiations. And I think countries are beginning to realize that all countries are eager to build infrastructure. I mean, all countries are eager to have development, to create jobs, to create economic opportunity. But at the same time, I think technocrats today are realizing the costs of pursuing that, in an over-enthusiastic fashion. That is having very, very tragic consequences today.
And I think that you would have to include the Chinese in that.
Yeah.
It's easy to say China did this, China did that,
Yeah.
but the reality is that China's lending was very decentralized. There were many institutions involved. There were different parts of the government involved, and I think it was quite a long time before Beijing came to really understand the breadth of what it had undertaken. And then it took much longer to begin to get its arms around the challenge of restructuring. And so I guess the next natural question is, what do we know now that we didn't grasp when this debt crisis hit, and what do all these creditors know now that they didn't know that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point to start with the private sector. And I think the private sector has come into this conversation in a very, very different way. And I think to come to their defense for a moment, mainly because of the global financial crisis, you now have a new regulatory landscape determining capital, leverage, liquidity levels for international banks and asset managers. So when I hear these calls repeatedly made since the pandemic that the private sector should simply write off a significant portion of their debt exposure into low-income countries in Africa, I recognize that there is a financial stability issue at play. I mean, I don't think any single international bank exposure to low-income countries in Africa is adequate to pose a danger for financial stability, right? We're talking about relatively small numbers. But the principle here is, in the past, the private sector has been brought into this conversation kicking and screaming. They came in kicking and screaming, I believe, into this conversation as well. But you at least now have a forum in the way of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, where at least the official creditors are able to talk to the private sector. There's inherent complexity in this process because we're not just talking about banks and asset managers, we're talking about bondholders who are a more assertive and aggressive lot.
Are the bondholders able to talk directly now with the sovereign creditors about these issues, or is there still a difficulty in sort of getting people around the table?
I think there's no problem with access. The problem is on the private sector side, you've got these, so from a coalition perspective, I think the institutional investors and the international banks are probably aligned. And we've seen that certainly in Sri Lanka, where you had the big institutional investors come together very quickly in setting up this creditor committee. You saw that there was a different set of problems in other countries in Africa in following the same model. So it seems like it's a case by case. I don't think there's a problem with access and with the ability of any aggrieved bondholder to speak to at least the finance ministry of one of these countries. But I think they're differing approaches, which makes this all the more complicated.
And what also complicates it is something we've not touched on, is that only a certain group of countries are included under the common framework, and that's the poorest countries. So a Zambia, a Ghana would be common framework countries, but an emerging market economy like Sri Lanka, which has had its own debt crisis, is in a much more fluid situation because it was not included in the common framework. And there seems to be an effort to a certain extent mirror the process between the two different kinds of countries, but it inevitably has become more complicated because of a lack of, should we say, a proper framework.
I think it's very fortunate that we haven't had a major emerging market debt blowout as a result of the pandemic. I think Sri Lanka is a relatively small country, facing grave political and social problems. But nevertheless, you've had a government in place for the last 2 years who are able to manage this process rather well. But can you imagine if we had a blowout of a major emerging market country with this inefficient process that we have in play? The consequences of that would be pretty dire.
to give a sense of how inefficient the process can be. In both Zambia and Sri Lanka, you have had official creditor committee, which is to say, in Zambia, a committee headed by France and China. In Sri Lanka, you've had an official creditor committee headed by Japan, India, and in that case, China's been on the outside as an observer. You then have bondholders negotiating in each of these countries, banks negotiating, reaching agreements and then finding that they don't align, or there's no what's called comparability of treatment with what the official creditors have agreed to. And I think it's a bit like feeling your way through a jungle in the dark with no light at this point, and that thus it's taken a very long time to get somewhere. Am I overstating the problem, do you think?
No, I mean, you and I have followed this every twist and turn for the last 4 years. And I think, I mean, the confession that I would like to make is I thought when the debt services suspension initiative, the DSSI, was introduced literally a few months after the pandemic.
That was a suspension of debt payments for a limited period of time, for debt servicing.
Yes, absolutely. I thought that would be kind of the building blocks, that you're providing breathing space for many of these countries in debt distress, which will then allow for an expeditious resolution of the underlying debt problems. And I think I was pretty naive in believing that, because what we have seen is, I mean, there was speed and agility at the start of the process, and I think there was certainly multilateral institutions, a big portion of the G20 wanted to get this problem resolved. But 4 years down the line, there is, there's probably some semblance of fatigue. There is some semblance of other more important global economic issues now getting more attention. And would you agree with that?
I agree completely. I think that if you were to look at the agenda of these meetings, the G20 right now, debt is clearly dropped down the list. I think it's partly a frustration with the process. I think it's also a desire to move on to other issues that are extremely important. Climate change is one, financing climate change mitigation is a big issue here at the bank and the fund, for example. I think that there's a desire to, I think, from some people to simply put this issue beside them. I think you also have new lenders coming in who are starting to occupy a vacuum, because, for example, the Chinese have pulled way back on new lending since even before the pandemic, and so we have an evolving debt landscape where ad hoc refinancing is beginning to occur. We're seeing that come out of the Gulf, for example. UAE, Saudi Arabia are now stepping in and doing bilateral arrangements with countries. Russia is making loans on the sly, shall we say.
Yes, I mean, I think the problem with having, for lack of a better word, unorthodox lenders, new players in this field who want to pursue their own agendas, who want to also pursue their own ways in providing debt, in trying to negotiating debt service obligations if things turn sour. I think that adds a greater level of complexity to the multilateral space. I think there's a fundamental question, given the world that we are living in, that multilateralism kind of has lost its sheen. That, every spring and fall, you've got these parade of finance ministers, central bank governors who convene here in Washington, D.C. So it looks like multilateralism is healthy. But you just look behind the curtain and you begin to see some problems. And what I'd be most curious about at the end of this week, is your point, is will debt negotiations and restructuring really be pushed to the footnotes, or will it get some attention in the communique?
I think that there's a long game that's being played by certain creditors, certainly led by China, that the longer they wait, the more that they can get past this wave of popular support for haircuts, for reduction in principal owed. I think China's purpose is to eventually get repaid, even if it extends out and reduces the interest rate it charges. I think we're seeing other creditors, for example, in the private sector, who are a little more willing to trade payment of principal later for perhaps a slightly higher debt service now. And I think that a lot of these issues are going to have to be worked out in a fashion that will not be, it will be messy. And I think it will take a long time. And I think one result is that we're going to probably see among the debtors sort of the emergence of classes of haves and have-nots, so to speak. Yeah. That some countries are going to be left on without a lot of recourse and will have to cut a deal with the major creditors, and others are going to have a little more leverage.
Yes, and I think the casualty here is, at least according to the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, global growth is on the rise, 3.2% forecast for this year and next. You're seeing the US behaving like an emerging market economy at 2.7%. But that growth is not being equally shared. And if these meetings don't pay enough attention to medium-term outlook for low-income countries, and how do you get them back on track, how do you ensure that they participate fully in the global economy, then you're going to face social dislocation. And those conversations on social dislocation happens far away from these Bretton Woods institutions.
That's right. Going back to the report we were discussing earlier, the Great Reversal from the World Bank, the World Bank estimates that 1/3 of the poorest countries have lost ground in terms of the state of their economy, that they are not growing and they are behind where they were before COVID hit. And these are countries that are going to need new financing in order to return to growth. And if there's no restructuring, or if restructuring is delayed and stretched out, there's not going to be room for them in the near future to get new financing. And this means that this will only be a lingering problem.
Yes, so I mean, my hope is when we hopefully have this conversation in 6 months' time, we would have been proven somewhat over pessimistic that the international community actually gets its act together and addresses these issues.
Well, perhaps our colleagues can hold on to the tape and play back all of our wrong prognostications in 6 months, but we'd welcome the opportunity to sit with you again and carry this conversation forward.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Jeremy Mark here. I've been speaking with Vasuki Shastry, an expert in the field of international finance and one of the great people who've worked at the IMF over the past few decades. Pleasure having you, sir.
Thank you very much again.